Hello everyone and welcome back to Study Monsters Programming with Python video series. This is episode 2 and we're going to be looking at variables. So a quick recap, last lesson in episode 1 we looked at Python itself, what Python's all about. The link to that video, by the way, is in the description if you haven't seen it yet. We looked at functions, what functions are, how we can name functions, that all functions are followed by parentheses at the end, which is how we call them functions. Everything. We looked at the print function specifically, which would output whatever's in the parentheses, whatever arguments we place inside of them brackets. We also looked at 2 different ways that we can print strings out so that we can join them or concatenate them together. So we looked at using the addition, the plus operator, which means that you're going to manually have to add in spaces in your strings to make the output look correct. We also looked at using the comma, which will separate arguments in your outputs, which will automatically add in a space. And there's different reasons why you would use one over the other. There's different formatting reasons that we'll come to in other videos as we go through. We also touched on comments and how we can get Python to skip certain lines in our script, where we can write comments so that we can, when we look back at our program, we can see how we're thinking, see what we were doing earlier on when we wrote it before. So we're going to very quickly jump onto our program now and just very quickly look at a bit of a recap from last lesson. Right, so you can see from here I've loaded up our program from the first episode, and we can see here on line 1 we looked at comments. So commenting code, if we use this hashtag symbol, the Python will ignore whatever comes after that. So it doesn't see it as code, it just ignores it and moves on to our next line. In line 2 here we can see we've used the print function. Print function starts with a lowercase p. It ends with, to call it, we've got these parentheses, so our open and close curly brackets, and then we've put a string value in there, and we know it's a string value because we've used them quotation marks. So this line 2 will print out and output to our console the words "Hello Study Monsters." We had another example here. I really hope you enjoy this series. Using the print value on its own with nothing inside of the parentheses is just going to give us a blank line. And that allows us to maybe separate out what our output's going to look like. We'll run it in a minute. We looked at using the plus operator to concatenate and join 2 different strings together. But if you remember, we had to manually put our spaces in. If we didn't do that, it would butt this first string up against this second string. So sentence and this would become one word. In the last example, we looked at using the comma, and the comma, you'll notice at the end of this string value and the beginning of this string value, we didn't have to manually add a space in because the comma is going to do that for us. And then finally, we looked at using comments at the end of code, so lines of code. So it doesn't just have to be on a line on its own. It will hit that hashtag and it will just not ignore anything that comes after that. So moving on to variables then. Right, so you might be sat wondering, what is a variable? So a variable is a location in memory which we've given a name to. So we might call a variable, say, age, for example. So it's a location in memory where we can store data. Now that could be data of any data type that we're going to look at. So it could be a string, it could be an integer, it could be a floating number. But think of it as like a box or a container in which we can store information inside of, and we can then retrieve it later in our program, or we could change it as the program is running through. Its variable, it can change. So if you think back to your maths classes, you might come across the terminology of things like x equals 7. So in this instance, where you're saying that x is using this equal sign, x is equal to 7. Or y is equal to 2. Now, it's really important in programming, and especially at GCSE level, that we get into the habit of this equal sign when we are using variables, that we use the terminology assignment or assigning. So this equal sign isn't comparing, so it is assigning a value. So it's basically saying this variable, this space in memory that we have called x, we are now assigning it the value of number 7. Similarly, we've got the variable, the space in memory that we have called y. We are assigning it the value 2. And again, it doesn't have to be numbers. It could be a whole host of different data types. So now for numbers, using x as a variable name is fairly straightforward, is quite acceptable. But you need to get into the habit of making your variable names descriptive so that we know what's inside of them. So if you were storing someone's age, it wouldn't be a good idea to call your variable x because it doesn't really mean anything. So why not just call your variable age, A-G-E, age equals 23, or whatever that age is that you're storing inside of it. So that is where we come across naming conventions, which again will help when it comes to paper 2, and it will help when you are working through your programming, so you can keep track of, well, this variable contains this piece of information, and you know that because you have given it a descriptive name. Now, when it comes to naming your variables, though, there is some rules. So, for example, you can't have spaces in variables. So if we were to use the variable name num space 1 and assign it the value 7, that is not going to work. We can't have spaces inside, so that will break the system. However, if we do num1 with no space, then we could assign it a value 7. That's perfectly acceptable. Another rule, we can't start with a number, so we couldn't switch that 1 to the front. So variables can't start with numbers, but again, the number could come at the end as long as there's no space. Don't use reserved names, and what I mean by that is that we've used so far in the last video, we used the print function. So we wouldn't, and you can sort of do this, saying print is and assign it the value 7, but that is going to overwrite the print function. Now, some integrated development environments that you use will prevent you from doing that, some won't. So please don't do that. Please don't use any reserved names because it will cause havoc in your programs later on. So print equals 7 is out of bounds. And don't use arithmetic operators because these again are reserved for other functions. So age plus year, because we've got an arithmetic operator in the middle of our variable name, it's not going to work. It thinks that you were trying to add a variable called age to a variable called year, so it's going to break. So enough talk, let's get coding. Right, so variables. Now variables are going to open up a whole new world when it comes to programming. It's going to allow us to make some very powerful programs now that we can create areas in memory that we can reserve for our own data that we can change later on. So we're going to just start with a very simple one. So if we just do x like we were looking at in our example, so x equals 7, that has assigned, and I need to, and everybody needs to get away from that x equals 7. We need to make sure that x is assigned the value of 7. So instead of before printing the number 7, so I'll quickly run that and we'll see what happens down the bottom in the console. So we've outputted the number 7 there by printing the number 7. We've assigned the variable name, the variable x with a 7. So instead of printing 7, we can just print the variable x and we should get the same effect. So it looks like nothing's changed down there, but instead of printing out 7, it's printed out the contents, whatever's inside of that variable x. So let's have a look at another one. If we do y equals 2 and we print out y and run that, we should get 7 and 2. So we can change these. So we'll look down the bottom here now. So if we were running a program and we suddenly decided that for whatever reason x was now going to be equal to 9, you will see that the third line down here, if we look down here, it will print out, it will run this line and it's going to assign this number 7 to the variable x. This line, it's going to assign the number 2 to the variable y. It's then going to print out whatever's in x, which should be 7. It's going to print out whatever's in y, which should be 2. But then it's going to assign and it's going to overwrite this 7 with a number 9. And then we're going to print x again and see what happens. So it should hopefully get rid of the 7, replace it with a 9, and we should get 7, 2, and then 9 in our output. So let's try that. So we've got 7. Originally, x was 7, so it's printed out. Y was 2. and then we've updated x, the variable x, with a 9 and printed that 9 out by printing x. Right, so that's all well and good in our previous example, but let's have a look at some different examples. So thinking about a program that is going to store somebody's age, it wouldn't be a very good idea to call our variable x. So if somebody was 32, for example, given the variable name here of an x isn't particularly very descriptive, right? It would be a much better idea to call our variable age. That's a lot more if we come back to our program later on and think, right, what's this variable doing, or what is it storing? Having a descriptive name like age would be a lot better. Remembering some of our conventions that we talked about earlier on, our rules when it comes to variable naming, we could have, for example, my age. We couldn't put a space inside of that and call our variable my space age, because that's going to break the system. It's not acceptable. Something that you may come across, and it's basically just about your preference when it comes to naming variables, is something called camelCase. This is something I use a lot. So your first word, if your variable name's got more than one word, your first word's always lowercase, and then any other new word after that starts with a capital letter. For this example, we're just going to leave it as age. So here we're assigning the value, integer value 32, into a variable called age, and we can print that out just like we did our x value. So we can print age, and we'll see what that looks like in our console down the bottom. So we've printed out 32. Now let's store a different data type. So we will call a variable called name, and because someone's name is going to contain characters, it's going to contain a string value, we still must remember to use them quotation marks. So you can see them quotation marks there. We are going to put someone's name in now, so let's put Spider-Man in. So Spider-Man is 32, and we're going to print the value, the variable name, so whatever's inside of name. So let's run that, and we've got 32 and we've got Spider-Man. So now let's think back to our previous lesson where we concatenated string values together. We can do the same thing with our variables. So if we look at printing a string value first, so we'll do hello, comma, my name is, close our brackets. So this comma here, now we can separate our arguments with commas like we showed in our last episode. This comma here is green because it's inside of these two quotation marks, so it's not going to see that as, right, we've now got another argument coming up in our print statement. It is saying it's going to print out hello, comma, my name is, and then we're going to concatenate name, so whatever's in this name variable. Again, we're going to concatenate again and another string value. So it's going to basically be saying, hello, my name is Spider-Man. I am, comma, and then we'll do age, comma, years old. So this should replace these variables with whatever is inside of them, whatever we've assigned, values we've assigned to them. So this should print out 32 Spider-Man, but down the bottom here, and in fact what I'll do there is I'll just put blank print statement in just to separate it out a bit, so we can see it a bit easier down the bottom. It's going to say, hello, my name is Spider-Man, I am 32 years old. So let's see what happens. So we've got 32 Spider-Man coming from these lines of code here, and then hello, comma, my name is Spider-Man, I'm 32 years old. So that's worked perfectly there. Okay, so that's it for this one on variables. Nice, short and sweet one. Please make sure you check out the description below. There's a challenge sheet in there for you to download and have a go at some different challenges based on what we've just looked at today and the previous episode when it comes to the print function. Please like and subscribe as always for more videos, and I will see you in the next one. Bye for now.